He believed the city belonged to him. From 47 floors above Manhattan, Daniel Cross watched traffic crawl like obedient ants while he fastened the cufflinks on his tailored shirt. The office was quiet, insulated by glass, money, and power. A half-empty bottle of vintage champagne sweated on the desk beside two crystal flutes. One was his. The other belonged to the woman perched casually on the edge of the mahogany table, legs crossed, red soles dangling inches above the floor. Her name was Lila. She was 23, beautiful in the effortless way youth often is, and utterly convinced she had already won. Daniel had promised her a weekend in Monaco, a penthouse view, and a future that glittered like the skyline behind him. He believed those promises were harmless. He believed his wife was harmless too. At home, he thought, Grace was probably folding baby clothes. She was 7 months pregnant, sentimental, predictable. The kind of woman who sent voice notes instead of texts and believed apologies meant change. Daniel lifted his glass and smiled at his reflection in the window. He liked this version of himself, the man who took what he wanted and never paid the full price. Lila laughed softly, teasing him about being late to their next meeting, tracing circles on the polished surface of his desk. Daniel didn't notice the time. He never did. He had people who worried about time for him. The knock on the door was sharp, intrusive, wrong. Daniel frowned and pressed the intercom with irritation. He had made it clear he was not to be disturbed. His assistant's voice came through, unusually tense. "There was a courier," she said. He insisted on delivering the documents personally. Legal papers related to the offshore acquisition. Daniel's irritation softened into interest. He had been waiting weeks for confirmation. He waved Lila toward the private restroom, promising it would only take a minute. She pouted but obeyed, unaware that her reflection would soon vanish from his future entirely. The man who entered the office did not look like a courier. He wore a dark suit, carried no smile, and moved with the calm certainty of someone who did not need permission. Daniel barely looked up as the envelope was placed on the desk. He reached for it impatiently, champagne glass still in his hand. The words at the top of the page struck harder than any slap. Petition for dissolution of marriage. For a fraction of a second, Daniel laughed. A thin, disbelieving sound. Grace wouldn't do this. Grace cried during commercials. Grace forgave. He turned the page. His name stared back at him in stark black letters, followed by allegations that tightened his chest. Adultery, financial misconduct, demand for forensic accounting. The room seemed to tilt. His fingers trembled as he flipped faster, panic crawling into places arrogance once lived. Photographs slid out onto the desk, grainy, undeniable images of him and Lila outside a hotel, timestamps mocking his confidence. His mouth went dry. The courier spoke calmly, explaining nothing, leaving everything. When the door closed, the office felt smaller. Lila stepped out of the restroom, smiling, asking if the deal was done. Daniel did not answer. He was staring at the final page, where Grace's signature sat clean and steady. Attached beneath it was a scanned image of a positive pregnancy test, not hers. Lila's. His knees buckled, and he sank into the leather chair that had once made him feel invincible. The intercom buzzed again. This time his assistant's voice was composed, almost gentle. His wife was on the line. She hoped he was enjoying the champagne. 6 hours earlier, Grace Cross had sat alone in their penthouse kitchen, her hands resting protectively over her stomach. The city outside was waking, unaware of the careful dismantling about to begin. She had not cried when Daniel left that morning. She had not asked questions. She had already asked them all. Instead, she made a single phone call, her voice steady, her plan complete. She had learned patience from pregnancy and precision from betrayal. Every step had been timed, every weakness mapped. Back in the office, Daniel lifted the receiver with shaking hands. Grace's voice was calm, almost kind. She did not yell. She did not accuse. She simply confirmed what he had underestimated for years. She knew everything. She wished Lila good health. She reminded Daniel that actions compound, just like interest. Then she hung up. Silence rushed in, heavy and suffocating. Daniel stood, pacing, already calculating escape routes. He reached for his phone, dialing his banker, his lawyer, anyone who could reverse what was happening. The answer came quickly and without sympathy. Accounts frozen, assets restrained, orders filed minutes ago. The walls were closing in, and for the first time Daniel understood something essential. This was not an emotional reaction. This was strategy. He looked around the office, at the awards, the framed magazine covers, the city he thought he owned. Somewhere below, Grace was already moving forward, her future secured, her child protected. Daniel Cross had built his life on the assumption that loyalty was permanent and consequences negotiable. As the city carried on without noticing his fall, that assumption finally collapsed. Daniel Cross had always believed systems bent for men like him. Laws were obstacles for other people. Rules were suggestions. He had spent 20 years learning which doors opened with money, which ones opened with charm, and which ones simply needed to be kicked hard enough. Sitting alone in his office now, the champagne forgotten, that belief cracked like thin ice. He dialed his banker first, then his attorney, then the private number of a senator he had funded discreetly for years. Each call ended the same way. Polite voices, careful distance, no promises. Grace had not simply filed for divorce. She had detonated a controlled collapse. When Daniel's assistant finally entered the office, she did not meet his eyes. She placed a small box on his desk. Inside were his building access cards, his spare phone, and a printed notice from Human Resources. Temporary administrative leave pending investigation. Daniel stared at the paper as if it were written in another language. He demanded explanations. He demanded loyalty. His voice rose, sharp and frantic, but it landed nowhere. His assistant had already turned away. She had been instructed to forward all future correspondence to Grace's legal team. Across the city, Grace sat in a quiet office overlooking the river, her attorney speaking in measured tones beside her. She listened, nodding occasionally, absorbing updates like a surgeon monitoring vitals. The temporary restraining orders had been approved. The financial freeze was airtight. The board had been notified discreetly, the language careful but unmistakable. Irregularities, risk exposure, leadership concerns. Grace felt the baby shift inside her and placed a calming hand over her stomach. This wasn't revenge, she reminded herself. This was defense. Daniel left the building under the gaze of security guards who pretended not to recognize him. His driver was gone. His car had been reassigned. He opened a rideshare app and watched the payment fail, then fail again. The city felt suddenly hostile, unfamiliar. He walked 3 blocks before finding a taxi willing to take cash. He sat in the back seat, suit rumpled, staring at his reflection in the scratched divider. For the first time, he saw himself the way others might. Not powerful, not enviable, just exposed. He went first to the apartment he kept for convenience and secrets. The doorman stopped him with quiet firmness. Locks had been changed, access revoked. There was a bag waiting for him, left with instructions. Daniel ripped it open on the sidewalk. Clothes, toiletries, a cheap sleeping bag folded with humiliating care. No documents, no cash, no reminders of status. Sirens wailed in the distance, and Daniel realized he was shaking. Grace, meanwhile, was finalizing the most delicate part of her plan, the prenup. Daniel had laughed when he signed it years ago, amused by the infidelity clause he assumed would never apply to him. Grace's father had insisted. A man who understood leverage, even in love. Proof had already been submitted. The numbers were clear. The split would not be equal, it would be decisive. The controlling shares Daniel had wielded like a crown would be placed in trust for their child. The board meeting was scheduled for the next morning. Grace did not attend in person. She didn't need to. Her attorney presented the evidence with clinical precision. Offshore transfers, personal expenditures disguised as business expenses, patterns too consistent to dismiss as mistakes. The board members' exchanged looks heavy with dread. They did not defend Daniel. They protected themselves. By the time the meeting ended, his resignation had been drafted, framed as a voluntary step back for personal reasons. Daniel spent the night in a mid-range hotel paid for in cash, staring at the ceiling as his phone buzzed and went dark. Lila called once. He didn't answer. He could already feel her slipping away, survival instincts kicking in. By morning, his email access was revoked. His credit cards declined. News articles began to circulate, careful but damning. Markets reacted. Analysts speculated. The empire he had built on perception was unraveling faster than he could comprehend. Grace watched the coverage from the safety of her attorney's office, unmoved. She knew the story would paint her as calm, reserved, dignified. That was intentional. Rage was messy. Silence was lethal. She drafted one final message to Daniel, concise and unemotional. Communication would go through lawyers. The nursery was being moved. The future was no longer shared. By the time Daniel realized this was not a nightmare he could wake from, it was already too late. His world had not ended in flames. It had ended in paperwork, signatures and doors that no longer opened. Grace had not screamed. She had executed. And as the city moved on, indifferent to his fall, Daniel Cross finally understood the cost of underestimating the woman who had once believed in him more than anyone else ever would. Daniel woke to the unfamiliar sound of silence. No notifications, no calendar reminders, no assistance buffering reality before it reached him. The phone beside the bed was dead, not from lack of battery but from lack of permission. He sat up slowly, the cheap hotel sheets tangling around his legs, and for a moment he expected the day to correct itself. It didn't. His name no longer unlocked doors. His signature no longer moved money. The illusion of permanence he had lived inside for decades evaporated with the morning light. He showered longer than necessary, as if heat could wash off the panic creeping into his bones. When he stepped out, he noticed the mirror. He looked older, not physically but in the eyes. Something brittle had replaced the practiced confidence. He put on the same suit he had worn the day before, now creased and smelling faintly of stress. There was nowhere else to go. He checked out, paid in cash, and stood on the sidewalk unsure of his next move. Grace spent the morning in a different kind of silence. The penthouse no longer felt like a shared space. It felt reclaimed. Movers came and went quietly, removing Daniel's things with professional detachment. Grace supervised without comment, her hand resting on her stomach as if anchoring herself to purpose. She kept only what mattered: documents, heirlooms, the future. When the door finally closed behind the last mover, she sat down and let herself breathe. Daniel's first instinct was to fix things the way he always had. He led favors that no longer existed. He sent messages that bounced back unopened. He drove across town to offices where receptionists looked through him as if he were already a memory. He was learning, painfully, that power without access is just noise. Every attempt to assert control only highlighted how completely he had lost it. By noon, Lila had posted a vague message online about personal growth and difficult choices. Daniel saw it from a borrowed phone at a coffee shop. He didn't finish reading. He didn't need to. She had already moved on to self-preservation. She had never been loyal. He had simply mistaken attention for allegiance. The realization stung more than he expected. Grace met with the board's legal counsel that afternoon, not to gloat but to stabilize. She understood optics. The company needed continuity, not chaos. She proposed interim leadership, safeguards, transparency measures that would reassure investors. The board listened carefully. They had underestimated her too. By the end of the meeting, they were no longer viewing her as the betrayed wife. She was a stakeholder, a strategist, a solution. Daniel spent the afternoon walking miles blurred together as he replayed decisions he once celebrated. Every lie now had a timestamp, every indulgence a paper trail. He found himself outside the hospital where Grace would deliver their child. He didn't go in. He wasn't allowed. The weight of that restriction settled deep in his chest. For the first time, consequences felt personal rather than abstract. That evening, Grace attended a small dinner with her legal team. She ate slowly, listening more than speaking. There was no celebration, only closure. She sig. Ned the final authorizations, each pen stroke deliberate. When it was done, she excused herself early, exhaustion finally overtaking adrenaline. At home, she lay in the quiet nursery, surrounded by soft colors and the steady rhythm of her breathing. She placed a hand on her belly and whispered reassurance to the life inside her. This was why she had been ruthless. This was why she would never apologize. Daniel returned to the hotel district as night fell, pockets lighter, options fewer. He considered calling Grace, imagined begging, bargaining, promising change. He knew better. She had planned too well to be swayed by words. He checked into another room, smaller this time, and sat on the edge of the bed staring at the wall. The city hummed outside, indifferent and relentless. As sleep finally claimed him, Daniel realized something that would haunt him for years. Grace hadn't taken everything. She had taken the parts he couldn't replace. Trust, access, the version of himself that mattered. And unlike money, those things did not regenerate with time. The news cycle moved quickly, but not quickly enough for Daniel. Headlines didn't scream, they murmured. Analysts used careful language, phrases like internal restructuring and temporary leadership transition, but beneath the restraint was a clear message. He was finished. The man who once dictated outcomes was now a cautionary footnote. Daniel sat in a nearly empty cafe, watching a television mounted in the corner replay a segment about the company he no longer led. His name appeared briefly, then vanished beneath charts and expert commentary. No outrage, no defense, just quiet erasure. Grace spent that same morning in a Dr. R's office, listening to the steady rhythm of her child's heartbeat. The sound grounded her more than any legal victory could. The nurse smiled, commenting on how calm she seemed. Grace nodded, accepting the compliment without explaining that calm had been learned the hard way. Panic wastes energy. Fear clouds judgment. She had chosen clarity instead. When the appointment ended, she stepped outside into the crisp air and felt something close to peace. Daniel's lawyer finally returned his call that afternoon. The tone was different than it used to be. Professional, distant, cautious. There would be investigations, there would be interviews. Cooperation was advised. Daniel asked what could be salvaged. The answer was brief, not much. The assets protected by trust would remain untouched. The rest would be subject to scrutiny. Daniel ended the call and sat very still, as if movement itself might trigger further loss. He tried to remember the last moment he had been truly happy. Not successful, not admired, happy. His mind went back years to a smaller apartment, fewer meetings, Grace laughing on the floor surrounded by unpacked boxes. He had been poorer then, but lighter. He had mistaken growth for expansion, believing more always meant better. Now he understood too late that some things don't scale. Grace met with the interim CEO candidate later that week, a competent woman with no appetite for drama. They spoke frankly about the company's culture, its blind spots, the cost of unchecked ego. Grace did not posture. She didn't need to. Her leverage spoke for itself. When the meeting ended, the woman shook her hand with genuine respect. Grace felt a quiet satisfaction, not from winning, but from being seen clearly at last. Daniel attended his first mandatory counseling session in a nondescript office far from the skyline he once ruled. The therapist asked simple questions. How did he feel? What did he regret? Daniel struggled to answer. He had always been fluent in strategy, not introspection. Words like fear and shame felt foreign, uncomfortable. But as the session continued, something cracked. He admitted he had felt untouchable. He admitted he had confused control with worth. The confession tasted bitter, but necessary. Time passed unevenly. For Grace, days moved with purpose. There were schedules, preparations, decisions that shaped a future. For Daniel, time dragged, heavy and punitive. Each hour reminded him of what he no longer had. He sold his watch, then his car, then pieces of a life once curated for admiration. Each sale felt like an amputation. One evening, Grace received a letter, handwritten, Daniel's. She did not open it immediately. She let it sit on the counter while she made tea, while she folded baby clothes, while she considered what she owed him. In the end, she opened it quietly. The letter was not angry. It was not manipulative, it was clumsy, remorseful, and painfully human. He apologized without excuses. He acknowledged harm without bargaining. He asked for nothing except the chance to be a better father someday. Grace folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. She did not respond. Not yet. Forgiveness, she believed, was not a transaction. It was a process. And she was still protecting her strength. Daniel never knew whether she read it. Weeks passed without answer. He learned to live with uncertainty, a lesson he never needed before. He took a temporary consulting job under a different name, far from boardrooms and headlines. The work was honest, the pay modest, the anonymity humbling. Grace stood one evening on the balcony of her penthouse, the city lights flickering below. She felt the baby shift and smiled despite herself. The future was still daunting. Power came with responsibility, and freedom came with loneliness. But she no longer felt small. She had learned the difference between silence and weakness, between patience and passivity. Somewhere across the city, Daniel looked out a different window, smaller, dirtier, framing a narrower slice of sky. He understood now that downfall is rarely dramatic. It is incremental, a series of doors that stop opening, a series of calls that go unanswered. He had lost everything that mattered, not in a single moment, but through a lifetime of choices that finally came due. The first snow of the season arrived quietly, dusting the city in a thin white layer that softened edges and blurred distinctions. Grace watched it from the nursery window, a mug of warm tea in her hands, her breath slow and measured. The room no longer felt temporary. It felt claimed. The crib stood assembled, clothes folded with care, books lined on shelves waiting for stories yet to be told. Every object in the room was a decision made with intention. Nothing was accidental anymore. Daniel noticed the snow from a bus window. He had learned the routes by heart now, the rhythms of public schedules replacing the private convenience he once took for granted. No driver, no shortcuts, just time and crowds and the humbling reality of shared space. He sat near the back, coat pulled tight, watching strangers scroll through their phones, unaware that the man beside them had once moved markets with a sentence. That anonymity, once unthinkable, had become his shield. Grace's days were full in a way that left little room for reflection. Meetings in the morning, rest in the afternoon, preparation in the evenings. She was careful with her energy. The doctor had warned her gently that stress, even the quiet kind, left marks. Grace listened. She delegated. She trusted professionals. It was a new skill, learning when to hold control and when to release it, one she practiced daily. Daniel's consulting work took him to a small office in New Jersey, a converted warehouse with flickering lights and second-hand furniture. The firm knew him only as Dan. They didn't ask about his past. They didn't care. He delivered insights, they paid him modestly, and that was the extent of the relationship. At first, the simplicity bruised his ego. Over time, it steadied him. There were no illusions to maintain, no throne to defend, just work. Grace received an update from her attorney one afternoon, brief and reassuring. The investigations were proceeding. The company was stabilizing. Public interest had shifted elsewhere, as it always did. Scandals have a shelf life. Grace understood this. She had never wanted spectacle. She wanted safety. When she ended the call, she sat quietly, acknowledging a truth she hadn't spoken aloud. She missed the version of Daniel she had married. Not the man he became, but the man he once was. Grief, she realized, did not vanish simply because justice had been served. Daniel attended another counseling session, this time speaking more freely. He talked about ambition, about the hunger that never quieted, about the fear of being ordinary. The therapist listened, nodding, occasionally asking questions that landed deeper than he expected. Daniel left each session drained but clearer. Healing, he learned, was not dramatic. It was repetitive, uncomfortable, slow. As Grace's due date approached, boundaries became firmer. Communication was routed exclusively through lawyers. Hospital security was notified. Procedures were documented. Grace was not being cruel, she was being careful. Every safeguard was a reminder of how quickly trust could be broken and how long it took to rebuild. She focused on the present, on her breathing, on the small movements beneath her ribs that reminded her why she had chosen strength over reconciliation. Daniel marked the days on a cheap calendar taped to his kitchen wall. He knew when the baby was due. He imagined her arrival like a distant shore, visible but unreachable. He wrote letters he never sent. Apologies refined and rewritten until they felt honest rather than desperate. He understood now that remorse without change was noise. If he wanted any place in his child's life, he would have to earn it quietly. The labor began before dawn. Grace felt the first contraction like a tightening knot, sharp and undeniable. She moved through the apartment calmly, calling her doctor, her sister, her attorney. The plan activated smoothly. At the hospital, the lights were bright, the voices steady, the process relentless. Grace focused inward, drawing strength from somewhere deeper than anger or pride. Hours passed. Pain surged and receded. When it was over, she held her daughter against her chest and felt the world narrow to something perfect and small. Daniel learned of the birth through a formal message delivered by his lawyer. A healthy baby girl. Details to follow. No invitation, no photographs, just facts. He sat at his kitchen table for a long time, hands folded, absorbing the weight of it. Joy and loss collided inside him, leaving something fragile in their wake. He whispered her name when he finally learned it, testing the sound, promising silently to become worthy of it. Grace named her daughter with care, choosing something strong and timeless. She watched the baby sleep, marveling at how something so small could reorder an entire life. In that moment, the company, the money, the battle that had consumed months of her existence faded into the background. This was the point. This was the legacy she had fought for. Outside, the city continued its indifferent rhythm. People hurried through snow-dusted streets, chasing their own urgencies, unaware of the quiet transformations unfolding behind windows. Power shifted, lives recalibrated, consequences settled where they belonged. Daniel stood at his own window that night, watching the snow fall, holding the knowledge that his store, why, was no longer the central one. That role belonged to a child who would grow up knowing strength modeled through action, not promises. For the first time, that realization did not feel like punishment. It felt like truth. Spring arrived slowly, almost cautiously, as if the city itself needed time to recover from winter's weight. Grace pushed the stroller through the park during quiet mornings, choosing hours when the paths were empty and the air still carried a trace of cold. Motherhood did not feel cinematic the way betrayal had. It was repetitive, grounding, humbling. Feedings blurred into naps into small moments of wonder. Every smile from her daughter felt like a quiet affirmation that she had chosen correctly. The company continued to stabilize. Grace attended fewer meetings now, delegating more responsibility as she learned to trust structures instead of force. The board respected her boundaries. She did not linger in rooms where power once lived. She made decisions, then returned home. Control had shifted from domination to discernment. It was a new kind of authority, one that did not need to announce itself. Daniel's days followed a rhythm he would once have dismissed as insignificant. Wake early, commute, work, therapy twice a week, sleep. He had stopped drinking. The urge still surfaced during moments of loneliness, but the consequences were no longer abstract. He understood now how easily escape turned into erosion. Sobriety was not a declaration. It was a series of choices made quietly, daily, without witnesses. One afternoon, Daniel received a call he had not expected. His lawyer's tone was neutral, careful. Grace was willing to discuss supervised visitation in the future. Not now, not soon, but someday, contingent on continued progress and documentation. Daniel thanked him and ended the call, hands trembling. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. But it was a door that had not fully closed. Grace did not take the decision lightly. She discussed it with doctors, with advisors, with her sister. She examined her own motives with uncomfortable honesty. This was not about Daniel's redemption. It was about her daughter's future. Children, she believed, deserved truth over fantasy. They deserved fathers who showed up changed, not performative. Setting conditions was not cruelty. It was clarity. Daniel responded the only way he could. He stayed consistent. He documented therapy. He accepted limitations without argument. He learned patience, a muscle he had never exercised before. Time no longer felt like something to conquer. It felt like something to respect. He began writing again, not emails or proposals, but reflections. Pages filled with regrets, realizations, memories reinterpreted through a lens stripped of ego. Grace hosted her first small gathering since the birth one evening. Close friends and family filling the apartment with soft laughter. She watched from the doorway, rocking her daughter gently, absorbing the warmth. There was no emptiness where Daniel had once been. There was space, and space she had learned could be generous. The company released its annual report with careful optimism. Analysts praised its transparency, its recalibration. Grace declined interviews. She did not want to be framed as a symbol. Symbols invited projection. She preferred substance. Let results speak. Let silence do the rest. Daniel was promoted modestly at the consulting firm. No ceremony, no applause, just trust, earned through reliability. The simplicity grounded him. He began mentoring a junior colleague, recognizing pieces of his younger self in the ambition, the hunger. He offered guidance without arrogance, caution without superiority. Teaching, he realized, was another form of atonement. Months passed, seasons turned. Grace's daughter grew curious, alert, impossibly present. Grace kept a journal documenting milestones, not for public record, but for memory. She wanted her child to know her story someday, not as a tale of revenge, but as a lesson in self-respect. Strength, she would explain, was not the absence of pain. It was the refusal to let pain decide who you became. Daniel marked each month sober with quiet acknowledgement. No celebration, no announcement, just gratitude. He still lived in a small apartment. He still took the bus. He no longer resented it. The scale of his life now matched the scale of his integrity. For the first time, that alignment felt right. Grace received another letter from Daniel, shorter than the last. No apologies, no pleas. Just updates, progress, accountability. She read it once and placed it beside the first, neither discarding nor responding. Healing did not require immediate answers. It required patience. On a clear afternoon, Grace stood again at the nursery window, sunlight filling the room. Her daughter slept peacefully, chest rising and falling with quiet certainty. Grace felt a familiar gratitude settle in her chest. The past no longer felt like a wound. It felt like a chapter, one she had survived, one she had outgrown. Across the river, Daniel watched the same sun sink behind buildings, casting long shadows across streets he now walked without fear or pretense. He understood now that consequences were not endings. They were invitations. Invitations to rebuild honestly, to live smaller but truer. Neither of them knew exactly what the future would bring. That uncertainty no longer frightened them. They had both learned in different ways that control was temporary, but character endured. And that lesson, paid for dearly, would shape everything that came next. Summer settled over the city with a confidence that felt earned rather than assumed. Grace adjusted easily to the heat, structuring her days around shade and timing, early walks and quiet afternoons. Her daughter watched the world with wide curiosity, tiny fingers grasping at light and motion. Grace found herself narrating everything, even mundane tasks, as if language itself were a gift she wanted her child to inherit early. In those moments, the past felt distant, like a story she once heard rather than lived. The board finalized the long-term leadership structure in July. Grace attended the meeting briefly, listened, voted, and left before discussion drifted into ego. She no longer felt compelled to stay in rooms simply because she could. Power had become something she used deliberately, sparingly. The company's recovery was no longer newsworthy. Stability rarely is. That suited her perfectly. Daniel spent that same summer learning restraint in small, uncomfortable ways. He resisted the urge to over-explain himself, to rush outcomes, to impress. He let silence exist without filling it. Therapy continued. The questions grew harder. No. Easier. Accountability, he learned, was not a phase, it was a practice. One afternoon, his therapist asked him who he was when no one was watching. The answer took weeks to articulate. Grace agreed to one supervised meeting before the end of summer. It was arranged clinically, without emotion, in a neutral office with clear boundaries. She arrived early, composed. Daniel arrived earlier, hands folded, posture careful. When the baby was brought in, he froze, not from fear, but from the magnitude of seeing something so fragile, so real. Grace watched closely, not with suspicion, but with discernment. She noted how he listened, how he followed instructions, how he stepped back without being asked. The meeting lasted 20 minutes. No promises were made, no forgiveness exchanged. But when it ended, Grace felt no regret. Daniel left the building shaken, not from rejection but from responsibility. Holding his daughter, even briefly, had rearranged something fundamental inside him. He understood now what had always been missing from his ambition. Not success, but stewardship. That realization did not erase the past, but it gave the future shape. Grace processed the meeting privately. She did not share details. She did not seek validation. She evaluated facts. Daniel had respected boundaries. He had not demanded anything. He had not performed remorse. He had simply been present. That mattered. Trust, she reminded herself, was rebuilt through consistency, not intensity. Late summer evenings became Grace's favorite. The city softened as daylight stretched longer. Conversations drifted through open windows. Life slowed just enough to be felt. She rocked her daughter on the balcony, humming melodies she barely remembered learning. There was no bitterness in her chest anymore, only vigilance tempered by wisdom. Daniel's life continued quietly. He moved to a slightly larger apartment, still modest, still intentional. He declined a higher-paying role that came with the same culture he had escaped. The decision surprised even him. For once, he was choosing alignment over advancement. The relief that followed confirmed it was the right choice. Grace began planning for her daughter's first birthday, not extravagantly, but thoughtfully. She chose books instead of decorations, memories instead of spectacle. The guest list was small. Love, she had learned, did not need an audience. Daniel marked 1 year sober, alone in his kitchen, a single candle lit on the counter. He did not post about it. He did not announce it. He simply sat with the quiet pride of having kept a promise to himself. The absence of applause no longer felt like loss. It felt like integrity. As summer waned, both of them felt the subtle shift that comes before change. Not dramatic, not forced, just possible. Grace no longer defined herself by what she had survived. Daniel no longer defined himself by what he had lost. They existed in parallel, connected not by bitterness, but by responsibility to something larger than either of them. The city prepared for autumn, leaves beginning their slow transformation, a reminder that endings could also be beginnings. Grace watched the trees from the park bench, her daughter asleep against her chest, and felt steady. Daniel watched the same leaves fall from a different street, understanding at last that growth required surrender. Neither so, yet redemption from the other. That work was internal now, and in that quiet, unremarkable truth, both found something far more enduring than revenge or victory. They found direction. Autumn returned to the city with a sense of quiet authority, the kind that didn't announce itself but reshaped everything in its path. Grace felt it most in the mornings, when the air sharpened and her daughter's breath puffed softly against her neck during walks. The city looked different now, not because it had changed, but because she had. She moved through it without armor, without fear of being unseen. She was visible to herself, and that was enough. The first birthday arrived without spectacle, a small cake, a handful of people who had proven, through consistency, that they belonged in Grace's life. Her daughter smashed frosting between curious fingers, laughing at the texture more than the taste. Grace watched, smiling, a quiet gratitude filling her chest. A year ago, everything had been collapsing. Now, everything was growing, slowly, steadily. On her own terms. Daniel stood across the street from the park that afternoon, not attending the celebration, not invited, not resentful. He had been informed of the milestone through proper channels. A photograph had been shared, nothing more. He respected that. Boundaries were no longer obstacles to him. They were instructions. He took a long walk instead, letting the weight of the years settle. He had survived something he once believed would destroy him, not because he fought it, but because he accepted it. Grace's role in the company continued to evolve into something almost invisible. She owned influence without craving attention. Decisions were made, structures reinforced, values clarified. She declined ceremonial titles. She preferred effectiveness. The board had learned not to mistake her quiet for hesitation. When she spoke, it mattered, and when she was silent, that mattered too. Daniel's life, by contrast, remained small by design. He still consulted, still attended therapy, still took the bus. He was no longer interested in reinvention, only refinement. He volunteered occasionally, mentoring young professionals with the same ambition that once consumed him. He spoke honestly about cost, about trade-offs, about how easily success could rot when built on entitlement. Some listened, some didn't. That was no longer his concern. Grace agreed to another supervised visit in late autumn. This time, the baby recognized Daniel's face, stared longer, reached out instinctively. Grace watched closely, measuring not his emotion but his restraint. He did not overstep, he did not linger. He followed every guideline precisely. When the visit ended, Grace felt something unexpected. Not relief, not anger, just neutrality. And neutrality, she realized, was progress. The city prepared for winter again. Decorations appeared, lights softened streets, people rushed with purpose. Grace decorated her home thoughtfully, not extravagantly. Daniel decorated his apartment minimally, a small plant, a lamp, nothing symbolic. Both had learned that meaning didn't require performance. One evening, Grace sat alone after putting her daughter to sleep. She opened the drawer where Daniel's letters rested. She read them all, slowly, without judgment. Then she wrote a short response. Not forgiveness, not absolution. Just ignore. Degement. Progress noted. Boundaries reaffirmed, future contingent on consistency. She sealed the envelope without emotion and set it aside for delivery. Daniel received the letter days later. He read it once, then again. He didn't smile, he didn't cry. He folded it carefully and placed it beside his calendar. It wasn't an ending. It wasn't a beginning. It was a continuation. And for the first time in his life, continuation felt earned. Years later, people would remember the story incorrectly. They would call it revenge. They would frame it as power. They would reduce it to spectacle. They would miss the truth entirely, that it was never about destruction. It was about preservation. Grace had protected what mattered. Daniel had lost what he abused. Both had been changed. On a cold evening, Grace stood by the window again, her daughter asleep nearby, the city glowing beneath a darkening sky. She felt no urge to look back, only forward. The future was not guaranteed, but it was honest. And honesty, she had learned, was the rarest form of wealth. Somewhere else in the city, Daniel stood by a different window, holding that same truth. He had traded dominance for dignity, control for clarity. The exchange had been costly, but it had been fair, and that was how a pregnant wife sending divorce papers to an office while a millionaire sat with his mistress became something far more enduring than scandal. It became a lesson. Quiet, unavoidable, permanent.